Hi, I'm Kim Rubenstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Canberra, and I started teaching constitutional law in 1993.
And hi, I'm James Blackwell. I'm a Wiradjuri man and research fellow at the ANU and member of the Uluru Dialogue at UNSW.
This year is such an important year for the Australian Constitution because we're being asked to change it. Now, if you want to change something, you really have to know what it is that you're changing. So this podcast series is to introduce you to the Australian Constitution, all aspects of it, to help you when you make your decision about this referendum.
So join us for this 8-part series as we explore the Constitution, the law, the vibe of the thing, and Indigenous issues in this really important referendum year.
And indeed, it's not just the vibe, it's the Constitution.
In summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe.
That was sensational.
So, James, describe where we're sitting.
We are in the library at the Museum of Australian Democracy in Old Parliament House in Canberra, just down the hill from the new Parliament House.
We are indeed in a beautiful room filled with books about democracy and areas of very great interest to our podcast on the Constitution.
Including a few books written by you.
Yes, I did have a quick look around to see where those books were, but plenty of books that I have. I'm very lucky in my own library. And we thought we would talk a little bit about this building as it links into the Constitution. And in one respect, it's through the prism of representative democracy, because we've explained how under our separation of powers discussion that it sets up a chapter which sets up the Parliament. And the Parliament is not only the institutional structure, but you need a physical building to sit in.
Yeah, this was the building that the Parliament sat in for 61 years, 1927 to 1988.
Yes, and interestingly, not in 1901, because of course it wasn't built, obviously, that when they decided to form a Commonwealth, they couldn't have a ready-made building. And so, in fact, the first Parliament sat up until 1927 in Melbourne. And we talked about the rivalry, didn't we, between Melbourne and Sydney, and how the Constitution specifically says that the capital has to be at least 100 miles away from Sydney.
So luckily right now we are 100 miles away from Sydney, lucky us.
So Canberra became that place, and this beautiful building that we're sitting in has been kept open to the public despite it no longer being a parliament, but as you said, as the Museum of Australian Democracy. And in fact, it was opened as the Museum of Australian Democracy now I did have that open.
I think it's 2009, I think
2009,
it was opened here.
indeed. Thank you,
So-
by a former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke.
Nearly 15 years, is that right?
Yeah.
15 years next year. This place will have been as a museum, and
Indeed.
it's great that they've allowed us to come here and record some of these sessions in the building. I think it gives a sense of realness. I think some of the constitutional discussions, given how much went on in this building.
Yes,
for
absolutely.
over 60 years of parliamentary constitutional discussions.
Exactly. It's
And multiple referenda
Yes.
were passed through this building.
Yes, indeed. And it represents, of course, the federal system because it has the House and the Senate still here, and you can see those different chambers. And for the referendum this year, whenever it's clear that it's going to be held, this building will be a super booth, a place that people can come and cast their vote on the referendum.
So like in a federal election, you can vote here from anywhere in the country, so you don't have to be a Canberra resident to come vote at Moad. You can be from WA or from ANT or from Melbourne if that's where you're from. So yeah, you can vote here from anywhere.
Yes.
It's one of those super booths where you can and they, I presume, have a great sausage sizzle, which is also something worth.
Actually, that's a very good question. I don't remember. I actually cast my own vote here for myself at the last election, and I don't remember there being any sausage sizzles as there were. Oh, but I did it as a pre-poll.
So then probably not. If you were here on the day, maybe you would have got one. Because I feel like for Moad not to have a sausage sizzle would be almost unconstitutional, Kim.
I think, yes, not as in the written form, but as in the convention that has grown.
I'm one of those Australians who decides how to vote based on the sausage sizzle location. There's that app you can get, right? The Democracy Sausage app where you can find out where the barbecue is.
Oh, very good, very good.
And of course, if Moad haven't got a sausage sizzle normally, I hope the podcast and me talking about it perhaps prompts them listening
Indeed.
to get up to get themselves together and get a barbecue for this year.
And James, there are a couple of other themes that we want to weave into this building itself in terms of constitutional history and history to do with representative democracy. From one lens, in terms of gender, when it was opened in 1927, there were no women who were members of Parliament at that time. And it wasn't until 1953 that we had two women, one for the House and one for the Senate elected, Dame Enid Lyons in the House of Representatives, representing a seat in Tasmania, and Dorothy Tagney, who was a senator for Western Australia. And there's an iconic photo of the two of them entering this building, which we might try and link to this, the notes for the podcast. And just this year, and only within the last short period of time, a statue of the two of them as they were walking that is now proudly not far from where we're sitting now.
Yeah, and you can see it as you drive up past the building, and as you come in near the main entrance, you can see that statue of them walking, I think, arm in arm.
Yes.
Up towards the building.
Not quite sure if they're arm in arm. We'll have a look,
They're
but
at
they're
least
certainly very
close.
close indeed. And one of they're not quite here. Here's a photo of you. They're not quite
arm in arm,
but very close. And one of the customs that appears to have happened over since it's been launched is that there are fresh flowers that are put in their hands. And there were this morning when we came here some fresh flowers.
Canberrans nice people?
Yeah, so
people in Canberra doing a bit to make the place look all spiff.
Yeah, well,
one of the things I want to talk about with this building, though, I think,
Thank you.
aside from gender, is Indigenous people in this building. So, and we'll come back to Senator Neville Bonner later, but he's the only Indigenous person to serve in the Parliament, or he's the first Indigenous person to serve in the Parliament as a senator for Queensland for about 12 years. He's the only Indigenous person to also serve in this building for its 61-year history, which is kind of confronting, I think, that only one Indigenous person ever sat in this building as a parliamentarian and none in the lower house.
Yes.
Of course, Ken Wyatt being the first lower house Indigenous MP,
Yes.
elected in 2010, not that long ago. But the thing I do want to talk about is actually the opening of this building in 1927.
Yes.
So we had the then Duke of York, but who became King George VI, so the late Queen's father, came to open the building in 1927.
On the 9th of May,
1927. With his wife. And no Indigenous people from the area or at all were invited to that opening. However, two Indigenous elders, two of my own community's elders, Uncle Jimmy Clements and Uncle John Noble from the Brungle Mission out near Gundagai, walked all the way from there to here over several weeks to present themselves to the opening of the Parliament, and also to reassert their claims for sovereignty and their claims for the land here. They are Wiradjuri Ngunnawal Ngambri elders, so this is part of their traditional land, and they came here to assert that sovereignty and to assert that as peoples that we were still here and we were still present. And so they rocked up to present themselves to the king, and initially the police weren't having that. That was not on their agenda to allow these kind of two poorly dressed Aboriginal men with big thick beards to come up and greet the Duke of York, Prince of the realm.
Yes.
But nonetheless, the crowd, the Australian people that were present, protested quite vociferously and quite loudly that these two Aboriginal men should be allowed to meet the then Duke of York, to meet the future king. So they were allowed to. They were presented to their Majesties or to their Royal Highnesses at the time, and were part of the ceremony, if in an unofficial way, but were part of the ceremony to open this building. And I think for me, there's a couple of lessons here I think about that I always think about when this story is told and when I'm also telling this story is, first of all, as Aboriginal people, especially as Wiradjuri person myself, our sense of sovereignty and of land that has never left us. This idea that these claims in the 2023 era are new or are fresh to our public discourse, that we've never really asked for rights and for sovereignty to be recognised. That's clearly not the case. This building is nearly 100 years old, and our people were here on the steps of the Parliament at that opening and before that opening, protesting and loudly asserting our unceded rights to land and to country and to culture. So I think that's really important that we recognise that this building has that history and is a really important place for that history. The second thing, which is slightly more 2023 related, is this idea of a voice. that the Australian people are the ones who didn't grant us the right to speak at that opening, but created the space for us to speak. You know, if it was up to the government of the day in 1927, Uncle Jimmy and Uncle John wouldn't have spoken at that opening, wouldn't have been at that opening, would have been shuffled off to a police paddy wagon, and we probably wouldn't have heard about them. They definitely wouldn't still be talked about today, or at least not in the way they are talked about in the mainstream of society and the kind of history that this building has. And I believe there is an exhibit upstairs, I think, that talks about them and talks about.
And there's a photo
presence.
of Jimmy, known as it says here as King Billy, standing outside then Parliament House in 1927. So there's a pictorial record as well, which is
we have the records of this. It has been preserved thanks to the goodwill of the Australian people. The people who were here in the crowd saying, no, Aboriginal people deserve to be heard. This is something we should be seeing. Even way back then in 1927, and sure, that's not necessarily a policy debate or it certainly didn't affect our lives as Aboriginal people. It certainly was a very symbolic moment rather than substantive. But I think it speaks to this idea that, to me at least, the Australian people are on board with supporting Aboriginal rights, are on board with giving us a voice, and have been for a very long time. It's not a new idea that we should have a voice. It's not a new idea that we should have sovereignty. It's also not a new idea that the Australian people are ready to walk with us on that. I think we're more ready now than we were in 1927, definitely. I think there's a lot of change we've made since 1927. I mean, we have a nice new shiny parliament up on the hill, which is much flashier than this building. But also, the Australian people have changed. And I do think we're even more ready now for that debate to be had about this, because this building, in its very steps outside, and as we walked in, this morning we walked on those very same steps, has that history built into them of Aboriginal people's presence and the Australian people's willingness, I think, to speak up for our greater presence. So it's really special to be in this building for a number of reasons. I think for me that's one in particular that's really special to be here.
Yes.
I'm really glad to be here for that reason and of course for all the other reasons we've talked about.
Indeed. And maybe to just finish off this introduction to say how important it is as a Museum of Australian Democracy in terms of educating the community, enabling the community to know more about our system of democracy, and how perfect it is that we're doing one of these podcasts, because the whole aim of this podcast is to enable people to know more about their constitution, which is fundamental when you come to choosing to vote as to whether to change that constitution. And the best way to make that decision as a citizen is to be as aware as possible of all the information. So we hope that this podcast series as a whole is helpful in assisting the Museum of Australian Democracy in getting out more information about the Constitution. But we're also really excited about the fact that this will be a super booth for the 2023 election. And we'll finish this intro, I think.
And of course, you can come here any other time, not just for the
course,
referendum. You can come
indeed.
for the fun cafe or the cool gift shop, or just for the museum itself. So I think
there are amazing exhibits throughout the exhibition. We encourage you to go and look at the museum's website to find out more before you come back, or come here for the first time if you haven't been here before. From that discussion, we'll move into discussing representative democracy and the Constitution. And there are so many different ways into this, but I want to start constitutionally speaking with what the Constitution itself, or what we can look at in the constitutional document in relation to representative democracy. And one of the first things is, of course, the fact that there is a parliament. So the fact that the Constitution sets up here a chapter which is titled The Parliament and has information not only about the structure of the parliament, but the ways in which that parliament is formed. Those things are key to representative democracy. So this, James, is probably a little bit of an intro to sections for people about the Constitution, but I think it is important just to know that. So the fact that there is a chapter, and we've talked about separation of powers, but the first chapter is called the Parliament, and it's got general provisions about the Parliament in relation to its legislative power. So Section 1 says, as we said in separation of powers, it has legislative power, and it sets up a federal system because Part 2 of Chapter 1 is the Senate, and Part 3 of Chapter 1 is the House of Representatives. So we know we have a federal system of representative democracy. But when I'm teaching my students about representative democracy, the two sections that I first really highlight are sections 7 and 24. And sections 7 and 24 are the sections in relation to how we choose representatives in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. And I hope it's okay if or in fact, do you want to read out the Senate section and I'll read out the House?
Sure.
Go for it. You read out the
Right,
section.
where am I reading?
Section 7, the Senate.
7. The Senate shall be composed of senators for each state, directly chosen by the people of the state, voting until the Parliament otherwise provides as one electorate.
Okay, so
And I'll pause it there because it goes on for a bit longer than
it does go, but that's the key thing in the sense that says directly chosen by the people of
as
the
one
state.
electorate as well.
And indeed, as one electorate. So the Senate, that's right, indeed, has one electorate and the numbers of people who are
Although
chosen.
there is, I believe, and just for a fun constitutional trivia fact, Kim, perhaps for our
Yes.
listeners, I believe there is a section in there that allows Queensland and Queensland alone to change that.
So the second paragraph of what James just read out says, but until the Parliament of the Commonwealth otherwise provides, the Parliament of the State of Queensland, if that state be original state, may make laws dividing the state into divisions and determining the number of senators to be chosen for each division. And in the absence of such provision, the state shall be one electorate.
So yeah, the Parliament of Queensland retained a very odd, quirky right, until Parliament otherwise provided, which it now has done,
Through the Electoral Act.
and Parliament could otherwise not provide. So for Queenslanders could have multiple senator
We'll need to
electorates.
look up the history around the convention debates as to why the Queenslanders wanted to do that.
Yes, this fun little constitutional
Thank
trivia
you.
fact for those listening that
And teaching me
Queenslanders have a
constitutional
little bit of extra rights than the rest of us do.
Absolutely. And it does say until the Parliament otherwise provides there'll be 6 senators for each original state, and that has, of course, grown over time to 12. So that's Section 7 for
Unless
us.
you live in a territory, in which case...
Well, that's right. This is only for the original
states.
states. So that's Section 7. Section 24, which is the mirror image for the House, says the House of Representatives shall be composed of members directly chosen by the people of the Commonwealth, and the number of such members shall be as nearly as practicable, that's it, twice the number of the senators. So this is this idea of a nexus or relationship between the House and the Senate, but it only is in relation to the states, not to the territories in terms of state representation. So, but the key words...
And there's nothing in there that gives Queensland anything extra.
No, there's nothing. Looking forward, no reference to Queensland in
So
relation to
just
that.
just the Queensland Senate, it seems, is quirky.
No, that's right. It was an equality in the sense that it says, but notwithstanding anything that they have written earlier about this nexus, 5 members at least shall be chosen in each original state. So for the first election, there were 5 representatives for each state in the lower house, in the House of Representatives.
Which, of course, explains why Tasmania still has 5 lower house seats, even though it perhaps does not quite qualify
Numerically,
for that many. It retains that right
Absolutely.
as a very tiny state.
Indeed. So we have got this section which says directly chosen by the people of the Commonwealth, and from a fundamental democratic concept, that is key to having a representative democracy, that people are directly chosen, the representatives are directly chosen by the people. So in many ways, that's the sort of the foundational section about representative democracy in our Constitution. And interestingly, in relation to that wording, we saw in the early 1990s a series of High Court cases which actually used that wording to say that there is an implied freedom of political communication directly linked to representative democracy. So in other discussions we may have, we have noted that there isn't a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, a specific Bill of Rights. People sort of think of the US Constitution and think all constitutions have Bills of Rights. The Australian Constitution doesn't at this stage. There might in the future, if there's any future constitutional change. But ultimately, the High Court decided that those words, directly chosen by the people, had built into it a protection for freedom of speech. Because what use is that right to vote if you don't have the freedom to share ideas and in fact, this year, in terms of having a referendum, which is another aspect of representative democracy in the Constitution, is about that. And this podcast is about adding to the freedom of discussion associated with political ideas and specifically for federal elections, for a federal election.
It's really interesting, though, I think, with regards to these two sections and this kind of idea of implied rights within the Constitution.
Yes.
Obviously, the High Court, I'm not going to go into that as much, but I think we hear the discussion a lot at the moment around constitutional change and the, quote, lack of detail that proposals may or may not have. Not just for this referendum, but previous referendums. In 1999, for example, there was a question around detail and models and kind of how much detail should or shouldn't be in the proposed new amendments. These sections are quite sparse on detail, aren't they, Kim? There's not a lot that's in terms of, there's no Prime Minister in there, there's no, all the other things aren't necessarily in that document.
Indeed.
In terms of detail, even though we have all these things set up,
yes,
they're not necessarily in that document itself.
That's right, because you see here that it talks about often until Parliament otherwise provides. So here in section 24, that the number chosen for each state is proportionate to the numbers of the people, and we had that minimum of 5 members, of course, and then it says until the Parliament otherwise provides shall be determined in this way. So representative democracy is built in saying there are certain things that are core to the Constitution, but there are certain things that we leave for Parliament to decide, and Parliament, of course, being the representatives of the people. So representative democracy is built into a parliamentary system, and the specific ways in which we vote for those politicians, those representatives, can be altered in the Electoral Act. And we've seen changes to the Electoral Act right from the start, including the introduction of compulsory voting. Compulsory enrolment for federal elections was introduced in 1911. So
over 100 years of compulsion in our electoral system. I think this discussion always interests me about compulsory voting because we are an outlier. There's not many countries that have compulsory voting. I think there's less than 10 or so democracies that have compulsory voting. Obviously, North Korea has compulsory voting for a different reason, as do other countries like that. But in terms of actual fully functioning, fully fledged democracies, Australia is quite an outlier. New Zealand, Canada, the UK, the US don't have compulsory voting. We're redoing, and we've had it for quite a while. It's quite almost a staple of Australian democracy that we have to go vote, and it is a mandatory thing. And I think
it's part of our citizenship.
But it fits in, I think, with this these kind of implied rights that to have representatives chosen by the people, you have to make the people show up and vote, while still allowing them the freedom to choose. But you're making them, in a sense, you're making them rock up. And the fine isn't terribly burdensome. It is around $20. Which is obviously not that much money, and I'm not sure if it's indexed for inflation, but I don't believe it is. So it's it's not necessarily that we're overly burdening people to vote in terms of the penalties to not vote. Kim, you can kind of not go if you don't want to, and it's a $20 fee you'll get in the mail, which isn't a lot of money necessarily for most people, not a lot of money. So it's not like we're putting hard and fast a lot of. It's not like the Constitution's overly burdening people with regards to all of these provisions, and not like the Parliament's necessarily doing that either. And I think it's interesting just to have the discussion around this compulsory voting idea, I think, because it is so rare globally. It's quite rare, but yet Australians don't seem to want to change it. We've had it for 110 years or more, give or take, and we still seem to be quite content with it.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of an affirmation of active citizenship, that it's built into the psyche of us as Australian citizens, that is not only a right but a responsibility, and people take that seriously. But I guess for this constitutional podcast, it's a reminder that there are sometimes the bare bones in the Constitution which are important for safeguarding a principle like representative democracy, but the specifics are all in the Electoral Act.
And of course, one thing that's in neither of those is the democracy sausage, which I do again want to mention.
Indeed. A different type of a cultural convention.
A cultural convention, along with the cake stall and the plant sale and all the other fun things. I think though that does speak a bit to the way in which we think about elections in Australia. It's not this burden of having to go vote. It is kind of a fun civic idea. We all rock up to our primary school or scout hall or whatever location it is in your various towns, or here at Moad to the super booth. You can rock up here, and it's a fun day. There's barbecues and cake stalls and all kinds of ways to engage as a citizen and as a voter for your representative democracy that isn't like waiting in line hours, for hours in a queue. It's quite quick. It's quite easy to vote in Australia. And I think we take that for granted a bit sometimes, but I think it's important that we talk about how our representative democracy functions in that way, because it is so easy for Australians to vote. You can pre-poll, you can postal vote without reason, really. You don't require a reason to get a postal vote or a pre-poll. You can just rock up early to Moad or somewhere else, or get your thing sent to you in the mail. Of course, if you're in New South Wales or a big state, you get these big giant tablecloth ballot mailed to you in the mail. There is some fun, I think, I take from voting in person on the day with a giant tablecloth ballot, and it's all bunched up in the corners of the booth, because it is quite a long Senate ballot, especially during the double dissolution election. That ballot in New South Wales was particularly egregiously long. But there is something, I think, civically responsible about the way in which we treat voting and the way in which we treat representative democracy itself with regards to voting for our members and having members come here for us.
And in some ways, that distinction between what is written and what is not written into the Constitution can also be understood from a representative democracy sense from the other section, which we discussed in our opening history section, but is worth just repeating here, Section 41 of the Constitution, which, to remind people, says, no adult person who has or acquires a right to vote at elections for the more numerous houses of the Parliament of a state shall, while the right continues, be prevented by any law of the Commonwealth for voting at elections for either house of the Parliament of the Commonwealth. And this is a provision which reminds us that democracy works not only in terms of through the representatives, but through lobbying and political activity that citizens and residents can undertake to advocate for political issues. And the women of the 1890s around the country, not only those who had the right to vote in South Australia and later in Western Australia, but around the country, had developed this universal suffrage political activity to advocate for women having the right to vote. And the women in South Australia who did have the right to vote for this constitutional creation, or this document, said to their representatives, we're not going to support something like this if we don't have our own right protected, and to push that issue.
I think that's a thing common to not just Australia, but to other places that have these constitutional documents as well. I mean, if we think about the United States, which has a very similarly constructed constitution.
Yes, and structurally in terms
structurally at least. When Wyoming went to become a state in the 1800s, women there had the right to vote in Wyoming, and the terms and conditions the US Congress tried to apply to Wyoming was you can't join unless women can't vote, because they can't vote federally, so you shouldn't be able to have them vote at a state level. And the women of Wyoming went, no, we're not having that. We're not going to become a state. So they applied pressure on their representatives and delayed Wyoming statehood until that issue could be resolved, by which point the US Congress had changed, and there'd been some changes at that level, and the Congress kind of relented and went, look, okay, you can join, but they can't vote federally, but they can still vote
in their state
at the Wyoming level. But I think it shows this kind of idea that people have, and sure that we're talking about period 850 odd years ago, in the late 1800s, but I think it shows that both here and over there that the power of this document does come from the individual citizens of the country, from the from the people who are being represented, not necessarily from the representatives. That power does lie with the Australian people. And of course, I think that links in a bit to our next episode, which
Indeed.
will be on referendums and,
Yes.
and the power of people to vote in referendums. But
Indeed. We'll come back to that shortly. The other theme that I wanted to link into that is, of course, that Indigenous people did not have the right to vote largely throughout the country, but Indigenous people did have the right to vote in South Australia. And what was a reflection of that historical material that we covered in our opening podcast about how the White Australia policy and discriminatory approaches and attitudes towards Indigenous Australians underpinned this document itself, is that when the 1902 Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Act was passed, while it gave women over the age of 21 who were British subjects, because of course there was no citizenship then, but British subjects over the age of 21 to vote, it specifically excluded Indigenous Australians and what the terminology natives of Australia, Asia, Africa and the Pacific Islands other than New Zealand from the federal franchise, unless they were already enrolled to vote in an Australian state.
That's really interesting that Maori people, by that wording, are allowed to vote, but Indigenous people of this country not allowed to vote. I think that we can have a discussion about the Treaty of Waitangi and the presence of Maori people in New Zealand society, in Aotearoa New Zealand and their society, but really interesting wording with the natives of New Zealand not prohibited from voting. Of course, Aboriginal people did gain the right to vote.
They did indeed, but often, and we talk about referendum, and we will move on to this in the podcast about referenda, but often people confuse the 1967 referendum as one that gave Indigenous people the right to vote, Aboriginal people the right to vote, but in fact that's not the case. The Commonwealth Electoral Act was amended in 1962 to enable Indigenous Australians to vote. So it's a really interesting comment in the podcast we did on citizenship between this difference between having a status like being a citizen, but what are the rights that flow from that? Indigenous Australians did not universally have the right to vote until 1962.
And of course it took another 9 years from that point for an Aboriginal person to be elected to this body or to the Parliament, which was Neville Bonner in 1971. And as I mentioned at the start of the top of the program, top of the program, top of the episode, I TV speak. Sorry, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, the only Indigenous person to serve in this building while it was functioning as a parliament, it still took until 1971, a good 70 odd years from the parliament's inception as a national entity, for him to for anyone who's Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander to gain a place in this building as an elected representative. And it's interesting to note that he was in the Senate, where somewhat indirectly elected, directly elected, but chosen as a part of a party list, and the successive Aboriginal people to join the Parliament following him up until 2010, also elected via the Senate. And we do see, now we have 11 Indigenous parliamentarians up in the new place. But when Neville Bonner was here, it was just him, and he was here for 12 years, and that was the only Indigenous person. He was the only Indigenous person up until Aidan Ridgway in the 90s. And
you mentioned party lists there too, James, and I think that's also important in terms of talking about representative democracy, that largely in Australia we've seen representation through party political frameworks, and it's only in we've had independent representatives in our parliament for many years, but the growth in attention to the role of independent members of parliament, of course, has grown as well. But we've never had an independent Indigenous representative, as far as I'm aware.
Until Lydia Thorpe.
Until just recently, indeed, until Lydia Thorpe's.
Because there is something to be said, I think. And of course, Lydia was elected on a party list. We should be clear about that. She switched parties or de-affiliated herself from the Greens. But I think it's interesting to note that for much of Australia's history, excluding the exceptions of Ken Wyatt in 2010 and Linda Burney in 2016, and the two most recent Indigenous parliamentarians elected the last election, Gordon Reid and Marion Scrimminger, also from the lower house. We only have 4 in the lower house. Most Aboriginal people elected to the parliament have been by the Senate, where arguably what's more important there is the party pre-selection than necessarily the Australian voting, because this of the way the parliamentary elections work with regards to you. Up until 2016, I believe, you just ticked one above the line and the party would allocate preferences based upon its own choices.
Sort of changed over time.
But I think it's interesting to note that representation for us has come via the Senate more than necessarily by the House. And what that says about the willingness of parties to put people forward as opposed to electorates and the Australian people, I think is very interesting that we only had 4 Indigenous parliamentarians in the lower house, 3 of whom still currently serving, 2 of whom were elected a bit over a year ago. But we've had, more, I think over a dozen Indigenous senators across that period.
Including Nova Peris.
Mawandiri McCarthy, Lydia Thorpe, Karen Little, Jacinta Price, and a number of others. But there have, Patrick Dodson, of course, there have been a number of Indigenous senators sort of almost doubling almost reverse nexus of
Yes,
Indigenous-
proportionality.
Indigenous lower house members. It's really interesting to see how that plays out.
You also said it was interesting from the time that Indigenous Australians had the right to vote in 1962 to 1971 with Neville Bonner, but it's sort of interesting to compare that to women's right to vote and representation in the parliament, because women effectively got the right to vote in 1902, white women, yet the first women elected to parliament, as we said earlier, in 1953. So it's a longer period of time. And I guess that comes down to a broader discussion about the nature of representative democracy, our system of representative democracy, who it attracts, and what are the frameworks that are encouraging or discouraging for different individuals from whatever their background to consider representation. The last point here, I think that might be a good point to finish off in terms of linking constitutional provisions that link into representative democracy and the themes that we've been developing about our constitution for people to think about, is multicultural Australia. So we've talked about themes of gender and indigeneity, but we haven't talked about the way Australia has evolved as a multicultural society. And of course, that's partly because the underpinning and starting point was a White Australia policy. That changed in the 1970s. And since that time, we've seen a great increase of diversity of family backgrounds and heritages here in the Australian citizenry. But we don't see that same representation proportionally in our parliament.
I feel like it's time to sound the Section 44 klaxon. Because I feel like this is where this is going.
Beautiful.
I'm sure there's a button at The Guardian or something where someone presses it every time someone mentions Section 44. It gets so often used. But yes, no, it is time to hit the big button for Section 44. Isn't that right, Kim?
Absolutely. So this is the last section I wanted to finish off with, in the fact that our constitution, in a structural sense, really has made it very difficult for Australian citizens who have other citizenships, which is common in a multicultural society. In fact, over half of Australians now were either born overseas or their parents were born overseas. So that generally leads to you having another citizenship or an entitlement that gives you another citizenship, or can have even be bestowed upon you without you even knowing. Yet that means that you cannot nominate to be a representative of the people, the highest form of active citizenship. And so in that sense, even though people can formally, on the whole, give up their other citizenships, I think in a practical sense, it is a real discouragement for multicultural Australians to follow through and fulfil that sort of most active, normative sense, I guess, citizenship.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously Section 44 covers dual citizens, and we've discussed that earlier and discussed that elsewhere. And we discussed also the kind of other Section 44 sections and what that...
Indeed, the other provisions.
Of bankruptcy, fiduciary interests.
Holding an office of profit under the Crown. Yeah.
Terms of prison terms of a year or longer, or treason.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's other things that can prevent you from entering this, or not this building, because anyone can come to Mowad, but entering the Parliament.
Indeed.
As an institution.
And not only entering, James, but actually nominating to be elected to be a representative.
And we saw some of that with the Section 44 kerfuffle of a couple of years ago.
Indeed.
It was Holly Hughes at the time, who was number 2 on the ticket, next below on the ticket for the Liberal Party, for the coalition in New South Wales. And the person above her, a National, was disqualified, so she was obviously next in line to fill that seat. But because she had taken an office of profit in the interim period between her nomination and her being eligible to be elected, she was therefore ineligible to take up the seat as a backfill, as a recounted senator. And that's how we got the late Jim Mohan into the Senate, because he wasn't ineligible. He was the next in line after Holly Hughes on the ticket. And that's how he entered that parliament, as a replacement, because Holly Hughes, of course, has re-entered the Senate. She has been elected the last election, the election before that. But it was interesting to note that even some of these kind of quirky, we had someone go for disputed citizenship, and then her replacement also ineligible for office of profit.
And the first person who was ineligible was Fiona Nash.
Fiona Nash, that's right. So Fiona Nash ineligible, Holly Hughes ineligible. And then we get the late Jim Mohan into the Senate as the backfill replacement for Fiona Nash. Mm-hmm. of course. And so that's kind of this weird it was a kind of a bit of a domino, Section
Effect.
44.
But a good reminder also, when we're talking about multicultural Australia, and we'll come back to this on the session on the Republic, but also at the time of Federation, there was no Australian citizens. So everyone was a British subject, or everyone born in Australia was a British subject. So that will be an interesting discussion too, linking back to Section 44 again when we get to the discussion about a move to a republic.
I'll bring out the klaxon next time.
Okay, all right. So we are completing in this beautiful library at Old Parliament House a session on representative democracy. This podcast was proudly produced at the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Special thanks to Rach White for her production. If you would like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, the Australian Constitution and the referendum on the voice to Parliament, please refer to the show notes for some useful links. The theme music for this podcast series is How to Vote by Patrick Hazler.